أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. Assalamu alaikum, beloved family. I hope you're all doing good, beloved community. We are continuing our series on the 40 Hadith of Imam Nawawi, and we've been discussing Hadith number 4. And so, just to get us caught us back up on our last conversation, I want to, or kind of center our attention, I want to just reread to you the translation of this narration. And so it reads, "Verily the creation of each one of you is brought together in his or her mother's womb for 40 days, in the form of a drop. Then he becomes a clot of blood for a like period, then a morsel of flesh for a like period. Then there is sent to him the angel who blows the breath of life into him, and who is commanded with 4 matters, to write down his sustenance, his lifespan, his actions, and whether he will be unhappy whether he will be happy or unhappy. In other words, whether he will be in paradise or not. By Allah, other than whom there is no deity, verily one of you performs the actions of the people of paradise, until there is but an arm's length between him and it, and that which has been written overtakes him. And so he acts with the actions of the people of the hellfire, and thus enters it. And verily one of you performs the actions of the people of the fire, until there is but an arm's length between him and it, and that which has been written overtakes him. And so he acts with the actions of the people of paradise, and thus he enters it." And this is transmitted by Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim. Now, I want us to begin or bring our attention to the beginning of this hadith, which describes the embryo and the process within the womb, right? So we're beginning at the beginning of our lives themselves, right? And this hadith is giving us a material description of what occurs in the womb to begin with. But right after that, the angel is brought into this narration, and the angel writing, pivotal matters of what is going to happen in this life, right? So we begin at the outset of life itself in its physical stages, and then these huge pivotal aspects and dimensions of a person's existence is being inscribed, right? It's being written right from the get-go. So one of the lessons to take away from this hadith is the emphasis in our tradition about the wedding between the physical and the spiritual, that these are integrated, right from the very get-go of life, and that life, the nature of life and the nature of existence, is both physical and metaphysical, and that or another way to say it is physical and spiritual at once, right? So this is one of the things that we can take away from this narration. The other, almost for purposes of our conversation, a more tangential point is that this is the narration that is often used in deliberations around abortion, right? And provides scholarship with a way of assessing when life enters, right? When life enters the embryo, or the within the womb, when does life actually begin? So they use this hadith in matters of fiqh, but that's not necessarily what we're going to be talking about today. One of the other interesting pieces of this is that when you're in your mother's womb, this idea that all of these pivotal things have been written or inscribed, right? It's almost as though we are carrying our destiny within us, right? We are carrying our destiny within us. And as we live our lives, we're actually discovering what was foreordained, but also written and known to God from the beginning, that all that's going to happen is already almost there, in a sense, right? Which is a very different way, I think, of relating to time. When you compare it, for example, to a more open-ended understanding of time that's sort of future centered, where the future is unknown, and you kind of you create your own future, you create your own destiny, you manifest it, right? So it's a very different understanding in relationship to time, almost as things have already, there's a sense of time that's beyond this time where everything is clear and known, right? And there's a sense of objective reality as it is a stability in time in a certain sense. So I want to just lift that up. Now, the other thing that I kind of want to point to with this hadith is like, why are we being informed about these matters, right? What is the maybe spiritual benefit? And so this is something that, I'm sharing with you as, personal reflections of mine that are, rooted, some of them are rooted in other narrations that I've encountered, but, just take it with a grain of salt. But I do think there's some beauty to this way of looking at the hadith. So one of them, starting at the beginning, so when we're told that our sustenance is known to God, that it's fixed and it's written, what that does for us is that allows us to pursue, a living with the knowledge in mind that whatever I'm receiving has already been written for me. And so we can pursue it, with a sense of composure, right, and dignity, and, not feel like we have to compromise on our values or gain an income through illegitimate means, right? That we ensure that all our earnings are halal and that they're pure and coming from good sources. That's something that, having this knowledge that our rizq, our sustenance is written, gives us the ability to maintain our values, right, in the way that we pursue our wealth. So that's the first thing, and also just as a point here on rizq before moving on, it is more than just your financial and your wealth that we're given. It's more than just our physical blessings, but it is all the blessings you can imagine: friendships, family, knowledge, even, right? Spiritual gifts. All of these are sustenance from God. So that's one important point I wanted to add to that discussion. Then with the lifespan, right? The ajal is written. So we know our life is fixed, that it terminates, that it's limited and finite. One of the spiritual benefits of that is simply that it inculcates in us two things. One, a sense of gratitude, right? That every day is a gift and that you handle it with that kind of disposition of a gift being granted to you that's limited, right? So you try to make the most of it and you appreciate it. And the other is a sense of urgency, right? That there is an end point. So I don't have forever. So I have to do everything that I can. I have to act urgently to do good, to be better to others in my life, to be better as a servant of God, etc. So that's the second piece. The third piece is that our actions are also known to God. And here I actually want to briefly bring your attention to this aphorism by Ibn Ata'illah radiallahu anhu or rahmatullah alayh. It's wisdom number 1, or aphorism number 1 actually, in his collection of aphorisms, where he says, among the signs one is relying upon actions. Among the signs that one is relying upon actions or their actions is a lessening of hope when a slip or setback occurs. I'll read it one more time straight through. Among the signs one is relying on their actions is a lessening of hope when a slip or setback occurs. Now, here, to bring it back to the hadith, when we know that our actions are known to God, we don't over rely on them. We don't over invest ourselves with a sense of power. Even our actions are in a sense tied to ultimately God's knowledge and power. And so we don't tie power, ultimate power, to our actions in a way that distracts us from God, but also that we don't over rely on them. So there's here, I want to sort of connect it back to what Ibn Ata'illah is saying. So one way of over relying on our deeds or relying on our deeds is when we assume that our deeds should have a certain outcome, right? When we assume that if I do this, then this should happen, right? And when that's related to our relationship to God, it becomes corrupting, because instead of your act being seen by, or like your act being internalized as an offering to God, which He can accept or not accept based on our sincerity, based on what the nature of the act itself was, with the attitude of an offering to God that we place before God's mantle and we pray that He accepts it, that's the sound disposition. We begin to inculcate a disposition of, here's my act, why aren't you doing this, God? Right? Here's what I did, why isn't what you're supposed to do following, right? But we can't ask God, we can't say that of God, you're supposed to do this for me, or you're supposed to do that. That becomes the internal attitude when we invest a kind of, outcome power to our actions, right? And so we begin to rely on them as being the means to an end versus God being our means and our ends, right? And our end, excuse me. So there's also a kind of, when our actions are known to God, it's sort of like our life's journey almost becomes a discovery of ourselves. Who are we? Who are we? And we're almost, God knows what our actions are, but we don't. And in the process of life, we're constantly discovering who we are and what are our actions, right? In a sense, what I think that does is that it creates a kind of tentativeness in us that we don't really know who we are. And we hope, and we kind of have this fear about us that I don't want to discover that, I don't want to discover that I'm going to, be a person that's not good in my life, right? I don't want to reach that discovery. So it creates a kind of tentativeness around even our good actions, right? Like, we could be on a roll, we could be doing great, right? But this hadith will make you pause and think, well, yes, but I could go off track, right? My actions are only known to God. I don't know what my next action will be. I pray and hope that it will be one that's good, but I don't know for sure. So that fundamentally puts in a sense of humility into the good that we do. It gives you matter for pause, right? And it helps you understand that you are not the master of your destiny, right? You are not the center point. And so let me pause here. This is like, I want to come back to the issue of hope that was mentioned in Ibn Ata'illah's aphorism, but I'll pause actually, and I'll come back to that. So we talked about so far sustenance. Knowing that it's fixed gives us a sense of dignity and composure in pursuing our livelihoods, and we stay grounded in our values. We don't feel we have to compromise because we know that God has apportioned something to us. Lifespan, we take life with a sense of both urgency and gratitude, right? Actions, we don't overinvest our actions with outcome power, and we recognize and realize that only God knows who we are ultimately, and we pray and hope that we're on the right side, right? So it gives us a sense of both fear and humility, and we try to stay in the present. We don't assume that based on our past positive history, or negative history for that matter, that we know what's going to come next, right? So it inculcates a kind of humility and a sort of discovery mindset and disposition towards our actions. Then knowing that God, knows whether ultimately we are going to achieve ultimate happiness in paradise or damnation in the fire. That, here's where I feel is more my personal reflection, but you've kind of seen it, probably reiterated or heard it before. But this idea that if we acknowledge that God ultimately knows, right, and we don't know whether we are going to be people of paradise or people of fire, but that is ultimately known to God who we are and where we're going to end up and the actions that we're going to do. I think what it allows for us is the ability to, at a higher level, inshallah, worship God not for paradise and not for hell. So the famous person that's mentioned this is Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, who was early Sufi figure, who said essentially to the effect of, I don't want to worship you, O God, for your paradise nor for your fire, but I want to worship you because you deserve it. I'm paraphrasing her, but here the idea that we can't really know where we're going to end up forces us to simply worship God because he deserves to be worshipped, and that's fundamentally what I need to do as a servant of God, is to serve him and thank him, etc. So that's kind of some of the reflections that I wanted to share with you on the wisdoms behind each of these things being known to us ahead of time. Let me now add a few more points here. Excuse me just a second. So I think I want to sort of end today's session on a couple of points. Towards the end of the hadith, we see this story or this sort of trajectory of two different kinds of people. On the one hand, the person that's striving to do, on the one hand, a person, let me not say striving, let me just say what the hadith says, which is a person that does the actions of the people of paradise until what's between that individual and the garden is just an arm's length, and suddenly there's an inflection in their journey and they begin to do the actions of the people of fire, and they enter the fire. And on the flip end, there's the idea that a person continues to, has a history of doing actions of the people of fire, but then there's an inflection in their journey right before there's just an arm's length between them and the fire, and they're saved, and they begin to perform actions of the people of paradise and thereby enter paradise. So there's a number of ways to look at this. I think the most clear sort of wisdoms here are, one, the first part of this, when you're thinking about the individual that is performing the actions of the people of paradise, and then they last minute slip up and they end up going to the fire, that I would say is the way we should be looking at ourselves when we're doing well, when we're in a state of obedience, when we're in a state of doing good. We should think that doesn't mean I know what's going to happen next, right? So there's a sense of vigilance that we maintain, and we don't become presumptuous that, yeah, for sure, like, because I appear to myself as a person of the garden that, okay, then I'm going to the garden. That presumptuousness could be the means of us inflecting last minute. The other point, or the other part of this, I think, can be helpful in terms of also, especially in terms of when we look upon others. Sometimes we cast a critical eye on people that are slipping up, that are doing things they shouldn't be doing. But this hadith actually reinstills and reaffirms a sense of hope, right? That it's never too late. It's never too late for someone to turn back. I'm emphasizing that this part of the hadith, we can take as our attitude towards others, but it's also we can also use it to look upon ourselves, right? but we don't know a person's ultimate ending, right? So we should never be too fast to judge others. We should always hold out hope for others and for ourselves, no matter how bad it looks, right? Because this is pretty bad. In the hadith, it describes a person that's been doing these actions up until they're at the very edge, right before they're, there's just an arm's length there. That means whatever they're up to is really not looking good. But then they move in a completely different direction before they meet their creator, and thereby they're saved. So I think there's a reaffirmation of hope, right? So one way to look at this is that the first part is really reminding us to be vigilant in times of obedience. The second part is when we're slipping up and we're feeling like we're not doing what we used to be able to do, or we're feeling just really ugly in certain ways because of what we've fallen into, then this hadith is giving us hope that as long as you're sincerely aiming to turn back to God, even if you keep falling, even if you keep slipping up, that you never know when that last moment will be before God delivers you from that, right? And that He can deliver you from that. So it reinculcates a good opinion of God, especially when you're in times of difficulty, right? Here's where I want to go to back to Ibn Ata'Illah's saying, where he says that one of the signs that we're relying on our actions is that when we slip up, when we make mistakes, we lose hope, right? There's a lessening in our hope, right? So essentially, when we're doing really well, we feel like the people of the garden, we're doing the actions of the people of the garden, we feel good about ourselves, and then suddenly there's a shift in what we're doing and we find ourselves in the muck. Now we tend to think that what's wrong? Why is this happening to me? Like Allah, we begin to lose hope in God's mercy, because we assume that now this is a sign of God's lessening mercy, when in fact it could be a sign of God's increased test upon us, that's making something more challenging for us, right? And if we excuse me about that. Yeah, the point I'm trying to make here is that when we over rely on our actions, right, it prevents us from having a sense of a good opinion of God and a hopeful attitude towards God when we slip up, right? And so that's one of the major points that Ibn Ata'Illah is trying to make. So in a nutshell, to summarize, this is the balance between both vigilance and fearfulness, right, that we're taught, and then having hope, right? We want to have vigilance and fearfulness, especially when we're doing well and we feel we're being obedient, and then hope, when we're feeling that we're stuck in our sins, that we were never relying on our deeds to begin with, even when we are doing good. That's the place we want to get to, is even when we're doing good, we're constantly recognizing that this good is really from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're not relying on the power of our deeds to deliver us. We're just relying on God and our hope in Him to deliver us. And if we were not doing that, then it shows up with a lessening of hope. We were actually thinking that these actions are going to get there. And that's why when the actions are less, suddenly our hope in God and from God is less. And that's what he's trying to say. Let me see if there's any final thought that I want to say here. I think the last thing, and then we can close, that I want to share with you all is, one of the commentators on this hadith stated something I think that's important for us to have the right understanding of this narration, is that the first situation of a person that's, acting with the actions of the people of the garden, and suddenly there's an inflection, and then they begin acting otherwise, and they enter the fire. That condition and situation is very rare and limited. And the opposite, on the other hand, right, which is the situation of a person that's gone astray their whole life but shifts, and then God delivers them and saves them, that is the more common thread of the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala operates, right? And to be clear, that the first one, where a person is doing the actions of the people of the garden, and then there's an inflection in their journey, that situation is a function of God's justice, right? That situation is a function of God's justice, okay? He does not wrong anyone, right? There's no cruelty in the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. There's wisdom, there's knowledge, and there's justice in the way that God operates. So that's something to be made clear. Then the other one, where a person who's been wrong, going on the wrong path their whole life and shifts, that is a function of God's mercy, right? That is a function of God's mercy. And we also know that His mercy overcomes His wrath. And so it makes sense that this latter situation would be much more common. So it's really important to take this hadith in a way that both reaffirms God's justice and His mercy, and to not read into it a kind of cruelty or arbitrariness from God, right? And that sometimes we do slip into that based on the way the hadith is put, or like a what occurs to our mind, which is not necessarily what's intended by the hadith. So I hope that this has inshallah been beneficial, and we can next time move on to hadith number 5. May Allah bless you all. We'll end with a brief dua. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. Oh Allah, grant us good in this life and in the next life. Ameen. And save us from the fire. Ameen. Alright guys, Assalamu alaikum.